Hello and welcome to the Motorsport Podcast in association with Mercedes-Benz.
For rain, for snow, for performance, Formatic. Formatic all-wheel drive, now available for C-Class.
I'm Ed Foster and I'm joined by our Grand Prix editor Mark Hughes, features editor Simon Aaron and the editor Nick Trott. Our special guest today, Karun Chandhok, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. Eagle-eyed amongst you will notice, obviously, there's a certain F1 flavour to this podcast, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're going to preview the 2017 season. There's loads of changes. The cars are wider, the tyres are wider, there's more downforce, the tyres are supposed to last longer. We have two new drivers. There's no Nico Rosberg, there's a pink car, and the McLaren Honda doesn't work. We will delve into all of those, and we're also going to take lots of readers' questions. We have so many that we'll try and get through as many as possible, but there is absolutely no way, and even if we kept Karun and Mark here for 4 hours, would we get through all of them? So, Mark, I'm going to come to you first and just ask, what are the fundamental changes this season to the cars? What's happened to the rules?
A lot wider bodywork, bigger wings, bigger tyres, and about 35 to 40% more downforce.
And they are faster, looking at testing compared to
a lot faster, about 3.5 seconds so far, but I think when you see it run for run comparison, it's probably going to be maybe 4.5. You would say that, Barcelona, 4.5?
Yeah, I think if you look at, as Mark says, you have to look at it like for like. Testing last year was a 22.8, and this year we've seen an 18.6, so that's just over 4 seconds. I think till we get to qualifying in Melbourne, we won't really know. But I think the other thing this year, which is going to be really exciting, is the rate of development. Because the teams, when you speak to the engineers and designers, they feel they've just scratched the surface. They've all very much got a launch car, and then they've all had to make quite an aggressive plan for development through the year. So I strongly suspect the car in Abu Dhabi will be quite different to what we've seen.
Yeah, because it's so different. That whole box where you work on the aerodynamics you're no longer just refining little bits. It's everything's open. So you to try and get the ultimate, it's a much bigger formula to solve.
There's actually a question here somewhere about where the development is going to be. He's asking whether it's going to be the power unit or the aerodynamics. Hearing from that, it's the aerodynamics, isn't it?
I think it's both, because I think that token system, which most people seem to loathe, is now gone. So I think it's easy for all of us to focus on the aerodynamic side because it's what we can see physically. But I think equally the power unit side is going to be fascinating. I mean, Mark and I had plenty of conversations last year about all this different injection stuff and various things that people are trying. Renault were one who didn't really use that many tokens in the last couple of years, and I'd be interested to see now that development is free, effectively, do they have the resources to throw at it in the way that Brixworth and Mercedes and Ferrari have done, and can they keep pushing on development? And that's even before we talk about Honda.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that. I think we're going to spend a large part of our time talking about McLaren Honda. But you've been to the test. Having spoken to the drivers, what are these cars like to drive? They are more physical?
Yeah, no, unquestionably. It was interesting seeing a lot of the drivers had the. I recognize the racing driver, my neck hurts head twist. You tap them on the head, say, "Oh, how you doing?" and they do this instead of that. So the whole body turns, and I was like, "Yeah, I recognize that. I've been there," which is great to see. And I think there's a certain sort of perverse pleasure in getting pain out of doing a physical workout or an exercise. It's the same when you go cycling. You want to feel that pain in your legs, and there's a sort of perverse pleasure you get out of it, and I think that was missing from racing drivers in the last few years. I remember Malaysia 2010 when I finished the Grand Prix and I got to Parc Fermé. You had Alonso, they all get on the weighing scale looking all fit and happy, go behind the banner boards in the FIA garage, and they're on the floor, and Alonso and Kubica's there with a bag of ice on his head, and they're all drinking cans of Coke to get sugar. But they look spent, and that's I think that was missing in the last few years because the race pace was so slow, and that should be different this year.
Do you think that's going to make it a lot harder for a kid like Lance Stroll, for example, who we've seen drivers coming up from GP3 and things and immediately settling in and being able to drive, as you say, 4 seconds off the pace or whatever in a race? That's not going to be the case for Stroll, and it's a massive step for him from Formula 3.
I think any time you come into Formula 1, it's difficult. If he'd come in the previous era, doing what he would have had to do in terms of tyre management would have been very different and very difficult. I mean, I had the chance to drive a Formula 3 car a couple of weeks ago, and I was doing long runs just to try and knock the rust off, and it was amazing. You had 0 tyre deg, and you have to remember that's what Lance has come from. So if he had got into last year's era of F1 cars, he would have perhaps suffered with that. So I think coming into F1, it should be difficult. Formula 1 is the pinnacle of the sport. It should be difficult. It shouldn't be easy for rookies to just get in and get on with it.
Mark, the cars are faster. They're more physical to drive. Are the fans actually going to notice from the side of the track, really, from an average grandstand? Putting aside the Valencian grandstand where you couldn't even see the track, but from the average grandstand, are they going to see it?
If they'd gone last year and they'd come back this year, yeah, you notice the difference. They are visibly quicker. You probably wouldn't notice it on a TV screen because it tends to flatten everything out. But in isolation, they look much more dramatic. I mean, you're standing at the end of the straight at Barcelona, and you're seeing them come towards that first corner at 200 odd miles an hour, and they're well past the 50-metre mark, and you think, when's he going to brake? And they just brake and turn in and goes. And you think,
the wow factor's back,
yeah,
isn't it?
it is. And at first you sort of go, whoa, and then you think back and you think, yeah, well, that's how they used to look before we had all this, all the subsequent, the limitations. So yeah, they definitely do look better in isolation, but you quickly assimilate it, you quickly get used to it, just like the drivers will get used to driving them. Your eye gets used to watching them.
2 questions. Have any of the teams with your analysis so far actually showed their hand, delivered their true performance potential in testing? And when is D-Day for performance? Is it going to be Q2 in Australia? When are we actually going to see these guys going absolutely flat out and the engines turned up to the maximum?
Probably be Q3 actually, when they really let rip with the engine modes. You'll see the midfields at their ultimate in Q2. It's intriguing what we see in Barcelona. Cars, Ferrari and Mercedes ostensibly look very evenly matched, and certainly talking to some of the Mercedes guys, they think it's genuine. I mean, the Ferrari was doing long runs quickly. It wasn't just that you think, well, all right, he's done a very quick 3-lap run, but how much fuel was in it. They do run different base weights, or traditionally they have. Ferrari traditionally run a lower base fuel weight than Mercedes, but on the long runs that wouldn't apply. So I think everything points to the fact that it's certainly a lot closer. Whether it's actually faster or not, we don't know, and I think it might be Q3 before we discover it.
Yeah, I think that there are 2 things that stood out for me. I spent most of the 2 days that I was out of the test walking around different corners, because you don't get to do that on race weekends. And I was at turn 9 when Sebastian was on a medium tyre long run, and Bottas was on a soft tyre. And like Mark says, I do think the Ferrari was a little bit lighter at that point. But at turn 9 is a tremendous corner to see how a car's working. And the confidence that Seb had, just half a lift, and the speed he carried through the apex was very similar to Ricciardo, who was, on a, again, similar time. We know the Red Bull chassis is very good. But the Mercedes didn't look as comfortable through there. And coincidentally, on the flight home, I had the chance to chat with some Mercedes engineer, and they sort of agree. They say that, in the high speed, looking at, don't forget, they've all got GPS data from the different cars they can look. And that seems to be a strength of the Ferrari at the moment, is in the high speed, the cars allowing the drivers to lean on it. And the other point to me, which was encouraging for Ferrari, was that they were able to swap to different tyres and still be competitive. They were competitive across all the 3 tyres that are really relevant. The ultra soft isn't relevant for Barcelona, but across the super soft, and the medium, they actually looked competitive, which we've seen too many times, I think last year, where you get to qualifying and they put a different compound of tyre and they can't switch it on, they can't get a balance, something goes away, and instead of the front row, or maybe row 2, they end up on row 3. And I think that's a good sign for them.
Yeah, they had a very narrow window of balance last year. And even if the track temperature changed from Saturday morning to qualifying Saturday afternoon,
Like Mexico.
yeah, it was finished. So yeah, we'll see if that trait's still there. If we see some varying temperatures, but the first signs are very encouraging for Ferrari. I mean, the car looks like they've done something different as well. They've been adventurous aerodynamically. It's very different around the side pods to anybody else. It's got the high inlets. It's got the funny veins ahead of it. So there's a lot of original thinking gone into it. So it might just be that it's genuinely fast.
The packaging around the barge boat side pod area, particularly, I thought is really impressive. I mean, it's not something you can just create or copy overnight either, because there's a lot of little bits that go together to make that, and that has a huge effect for the airflow in the rear of the car. And one thing that really stood out for me, when you stand at turn 3 at Barcelona, you see them sort of come past you all the way around 1, 2, and 3. And Kimi was on a wider line, lap after lap, for whatever reason he chose that line. And you could actually see, dust and marbles coming off the left-hand tyres a little bit.
It was the same at 10. He wasn't making an apex at 10
Yeah,
either.
he was but 3 is a high-speed corner.
Yeah.
But the rear of the car was planted. He had his foot hard in. He was hard on the throttle. The rear of the car planted, and he still had the grip. And I thought, that's an impressive sign. Anybody else who was out there, you'd start to see a bit of movement. And to me, that was actually quite impressive to see.
We may need that more than ever this year. We may need drivers and cars to take alternative lines if what we're hearing about overtaking is going to be more difficult.
Aerodynamically, it's obviously you got shorter braking distances basically, and you still got the same trouble with the front wing, through the preceding corner. Although one of the things that they think the lower wing should do is that it places the wake in a less damaging place for the following car. But I think that'll sort of even itself out. It'll be much of a muchness in terms of that.
Slipstream should be more powerful, though, shouldn't it?
Slipstream will be more
because
powerful.
the drag is higher.
Yeah, but some corners that were brake are now just a lift, and so that working against it. There'll be fewer marbles, so the line will stay wider for longer. But on the other hand, the cars themselves are wider. So I think it'll sort of balance itself out. I don't think there'll be a radical difference in the quality of the racing, but at least that what you're watching as the drivers, hopefully, is that the drivers going flat out, which you knew wasn't the case before.
Well, one of the big changes, obviously, the Pirelli tyres. Mark, you did a very interesting piece on the Motorsport website recently about what Pirelli has done to the tyres, but whilst they've stopped the rate of degradation, they haven't exactly improved things in terms of with a view to looking to exciting racing. It's
an improvement. It's definitely an improvement on what we had on the tyres that once you got them to too hot, they were finished. That's gone, and that's what they were primarily asked to stop doing. On the evidence of Barcelona, it looked as though they just certainly on the medium tyre there was no discernible deg at all. So that if that pattern holds, you'd get a lot of one-stop races. There was signs on some of the long runs on the soft tyre that there is some deg. It's a bit of a balancing act that Pirelli's got to pull off here, and I think on a relatively cool winter's day in Barcelona, it's probably not totally fair to try and transpose that on what we're going to see. But I'd say it's definitely better.
I think there's a couple of points. One is that they should really be aiming for a 2-stop race to make the racing interesting. I think a 1-stop is not going to be particularly interesting. And I spoke to Mario Isola at Pirelli about that. And I said, what happens if we get to the first 4 races and we only see 1-stops? Will you have the flexibility to go down a range perhaps on the tyre compound further into the season? And he actually said they were quite open to the idea of sort of reevaluating things after the first 3 or 4 races and saying, you know what, we need to do something for the racing here and basically go one step down, which traditionally they've been quite conservative in their
Yeah.
choice of compounds, haven't they, over the last 5-6 years?
But I think there's a bit of a misconception about tyre deg. I think people think that tyre deg in itself is what was bad, and it wasn't. It was the fact. It was the type of deg that we had. It was the fact that
Yeah, it was thermal take.
Yeah, and it was the fact that it was permanent. Even if we've had tyres in the past, proper racing tyres, where you can get heat deg, they get too hot to be able to support the load, but you back off for a few corners and they come back. Well, these didn't, and that's what was bad. So it meant that the fastest way to drive a Grand Prix was to drive off the pace, and that's just fundamentally wrong. That's philosophically wrong. That's just wrong on so many levels, and that's what we've got rid of. So that's good.
So one of the big changes is Liberty Media. They've come in. They're now owners. Karun, what can we expect from them this year in terms of changes? And I know, just from going to the Barcelona test, one of the big changes, big for the teams anyway, the teams are allowed to share short videos on social media, before they weren't even allowed to film within 5 kilometres of the circuit. Which, as a team, you're putting all the money into the sport, yet you're not even allowed to share video on social media. It seems ridiculous, but that's obviously a small change. What can we expect from them?
Yeah, and I think that's a good first step. Personally, I don't think we're going to see anything change dramatically over the next couple of years. I think one of the key points, really, which Ross Brawn highlighted in a number of interviews I've seen, is that Formula One's been too reactive, and really what they need to be doing is looking down the line. What is the vision for the sport 2020 onwards? Because 2020 is a big year where the contracts with all the teams get renewed. There's a lot of stuff with different races. The new Concord agreement, or whatever it's going to be called at that point. And I think that's when we'll really see the true effect. Don't forget, there's a lot of long-term contracts already in place. So, yeah, we'll see some small changes here and there. I think they're more actively pushing the marketing and promotional side. I know they're recruiting very heavily on the in terms of personnel for the PR marketing side, which is what they need. But I don't think we're going to see revolutionary stuff in the next couple of years. And I think that's right. I think they need, rather than do knee-jerk changes, I think it's good to have a period of taking stock and then make a step-by-step research. Yeah.
I'm really excited about that. Sorry. Any sport, in particular Formula One, is more enjoyable when you have a real passion for a team or a driver, and everything you do is about following that person or that team. And I think it's if you're discovering Formula One and have been over the last 5 years or so, you're probably going through all the teams going, well, who do I follow? You haven't really had enough media necessarily from the teams or the drivers themselves to actually really hook into someone. So I was really excited that Red Bull delivered a video that evening of the first test. I thought that was impressive. And equally, Ferrari seemed to have some kind of blackout, in the first 2 days. And I was at Maranello during the tests, and it was clear that was a strategy. Just don't tell anyone about it. But in the restaurants and everything, everyone was going, why don't we know what's happening with Ferrari, what's happening with our team? And of course, Red Bull have already produced a film. Yeah. That's brilliant for the fan.
That's what the fans want. I mean, and I think America knows how to do sport, don't they? And when you look at it, and that's why, I'll be honest, I was a little bit disappointed that Haas weren't more NASCAR in their approach, and they ended up going down the sort of Formula One route. We should be able, if you look at a NASCAR race, and there's a yellow with 10 laps to go, the TV people are there talking to a Stuart Haas engineer, or the crew chief as they call it, or even Gene Haas, on the wall, as he pushes the headset back and he's talking to the TV guy, and he's, and I was hoping for a bit more of that, and I was hoping that they would rub off on everybody else. But in the end, they sort of went the F1 route of everybody else, and having a PR man as a filter to everything, and actually being quite closed off like everybody else. So I hope they change that. Well,
I mean, there are certain other aspects of the NASCAR model we could adopt, like more punch-ups in the pit lane afterwards.
Oh, the last week one was hilarious, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was brilliant.
Yeah.
We got a question here from Nauman Mithani. What improvements do we want from Ross Brawn, Mark, in terms of short-term and then long-term as well? Because he is looking after the motorsport side of things.
Yeah, he's looking after the sport and technical sides. And on those, I don't think you're going to see any quick change. Like as Karun was saying before, you're going to see a lot of stuff going on in the back, or you're not going to see it. It's going on in the background, where he's going to have a team of people around him researching how to get to where they want and where they want to be. Is cars that are better to race, cars that excite the fans more, so that they've got better raw material to work with on a promotional side. I think it's gonna be an era compared to what we've had for the last 30 odd years. It's not going to be so openly confrontational. There's always going to be arguments and negotiations going on in the background, but the way of resolving those is going to be much less confrontational. And I think with Ross, there are three strands of the sport. There's the commercial rights holder, there's the FIA, and the teams. And traditionally, any two of those have been in dispute with each other at any given time. And that's just how it's worked. That's just the personalities involved. Now, Ross works for the commercial rights holder. He used to be a team boss, and he's got a very good relationship with the president of the FIA. So he is in a unique position, better than anybody in history has ever been, to pull those together, those three threads together as one. And I think he will do that. I think Ross is just someone calm, analytical, but with a core of steel. He'll just be like a tank going towards its target. You will get there.
I think for me the one of the big issues heading to 2020, and it's not again something that we resolved before, is how they can safeguard the future of teams and how we can get another team or two on the grid and not have this big disparity. And speaking privately I spoke to probably 3 different team bosses in Barcelona, and really the only way to do it is to tear up the existing model and start again. Whether they can or not is a different story. But
yeah, post 2020, that's what they will have to do. So then you get into a very difficult negotiation with principally Ferrari, whereby you say, look, we're going to redistribute the income.
meritocratically.
Yeah, and then you're going to have a potential standoff, and that's going to be the big, I think,
And then Mercedes
2-3 years down
the line, aren't they? Because
So-
Red Bull with 2 teams.
Yeah, I mean, and he's also, the other thing Ross is going to try and impose that he already said he would like to impose is some level of cost cap. So again, you're going to have 3 teams saying absolutely not, and the other 7 saying yes please, yes please, yes please. So how you resolve that as well. So yeah, it's all nicey at the moment because it's new owners.
Oh yeah.
And it's a nice reboot and all relationship.
Kind of a honeymoon, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But there are some very, very difficult questions to be resolved.
But I have to say, I would, and I've mentioned it in previous F1 preview podcasts, I would love to see some form of cost cap and greater technical freedom. I just think it'd be brilliant.
I think that's something that Ross would like to see as well. Long term.
I struggle with the idea of how you'd police a cost
Yeah,
cap.
so do I. I have no idea how you do it, but
Especially at Ferrari.
yeah.
Well,
Or anyone.
or a company like Mercedes or Renault who've got companies set up all around the world. How are you ever going to monitor all of that?
Yeah.
It's just. I think that is. I think the more interesting thing is to see, can you create a system where the cost-benefit ratio effectively becomes self-policing, meaning, by spending an extra 100 million, if you're only going to find a 1/10 of a second, well, really, does that justify spending it? And then it sort of becomes self-policing. That's the only way I can see it happening.
Or maybe you say you can spend what you want, but once above a certain rate, it's 99% tax, and you give the other 99% to the other teams.
That'll be the Eddie Jordan model, then.
Let's turn our focus to 2017. We've mentioned it. We've all had a bit of a.
What were we talking about? 16 to now?
But what we're about to talk about, we've obviously mentioned it. McLaren Honda. What has happened, Karun, and is there light at the end of the tunnel?
I'm struggling to see it in the same way that I think everyone in Barcelona and that garage is struggling to see it. Yeah, I mean, I saw Fernando briefly on Friday. I think it was the Was he driving the final day of the test? Yeah, it was the Friday. And he just sort of shrugged and waved and said, sort of, I don't know what to say. And I was like, yep. and it's just, there's a lot of shrugging the shoulders and rolling the eyes from the McLaren side of it, and a lot of stressed looking people from the Honda side. We've done 8 days of testing, and the whole of the second week they couldn't do 11 laps in a row, which is less laps than they'd do in a qualifying session, let alone a Grand Prix, really.
Yeah, I mean, the secret of what's wrong is hidden deep within the internals of that engine. And so it's a fundamental problem, clearly, and it was only discovered, when they got the car on the track. Although apparently it was problematical in a different way on the dyno, and they resolved some things on the dyno, but something different came up when they ran it on the track. So, it's just how long does it take to get that fix in place? We don't know, because obviously they're being very secretive about exactly what it is. It could be that, within a couple of months, they've found the magic thing that switches it all on and lets you run at full power, and it turns out it's okay. But that's, the best possible outcome. The other one is it's just a fundamentally flawed engine, and we've got this all season, a bit like 2015.
Is it fair for McLaren to say it is all Honda's fault? But what is the McLaren chassis actually like? Does that mean it's tough to tell?
I think it's too difficult.
Impossible to judge.
Yeah, you can't. It's running reduced power. It's running hardly any laps.
It's hardly running.
Well, and all of it. You listen to the gear shifts down side right. Every time I saw Fernando, every time he does an upshift, there's such a cut in the gear cut on the torque curve. The rear of the car actually moves. They haven't had time to set up the electronics. The engine braking's not set up. The harvesting of the ERS affects the balance. And, you can't judge anything just with all the problems they've had.
Yeah, and once they've realised they've got a serious problem, they will and decided to try and run it in sort of limp home mode, almost, which is effectively what they've had to do. Someone will have had to reconfigure a lot of software in a hurry, so I'm sure that's got a lot to do with why it suddenly stops on an outlap and brings the red flags out. So it just compounds and compounds.
And that really affects the motivation of people as well, from the McLaren side. What is the motivation from the aero design chassis side for the guys to be looking for the extra half-tenth when they're missing 2 seconds in another department?
You can imagine it just must be horribly frustrating. It must just be awful.
Okay, so you're Zach Brown. What do you do now? Do you very quietly in the background try and court another engine partner who's already in the sport, or do you stick with Honda?
In theory, and you would think there is capacity there for Mercedes to supply an engine on a customer basis. It's no longer supplying Manor, and everything had been geared around doing that. It's been the best engine. We'll see if it still is, but it's certainly a competitive engine. I think if you're Zach Brown, you're probably having a very serious talk with your shareholders and saying, is this the time to pump some money in to invest in the team, to do something like that if it costs money to get it? I think it's something you've got to be considering in the background. As I say, it may be a short, quick, easy fix that just looked disastrous at the time and actually was just a hiccup. But if this is a real long-term problem and you don't have faith that it's going to change, then maybe it is time to start thinking that, sort of like they did in '93, they were running Cosworths in between, manufacturer deals. They might have to think of something like that again.
I mean, the part that I don't get is that, I go back to, let's say, the super successful McLaren Honda day of past, but they had a car out in Suzuka all the time with Alan McNish or Jonathan Palmer or Mark Blundell. These guys were pounding round and round and round. Forget the race drivers. And even in the next era, I'm pretty sure Anthony Davidson was pounding around Suzuka in some form of test car. So you've got testing regulations, I get that, but Honda also own and supply half the grid of Super Formula cars.
And on the circuit.
The car produces a ton of downforce. I don't get why they haven't created this test mule that's just running non-stop. I mean, to me, that's a little bit of a sign of commitment to solve, to problem solve.
Just from the outside, it just looks a bit like an interesting little R&D project for some of the engineers, as opposed to a serious, full-on effort from a manufacturer.
Yeah. That's the thing.
It just has the look of a backed-up R&D project, which is, it might be unfair. There might be hundreds of people that we don't see working absolutely flat out, but I do wonder how much commitment they're showing it.
Does Honda still recycle its engineers on a regular basis like it used to?
Yeah.
So the lack of continuity.
Yeah, but I mean, they had that system in place when they were winning.
But
world
it's
championships.
quite clear that when whatever they're seeing on the dyno is one thing, but it's quite clear that there's a lot of issues when you put the car on track and you've got all the stresses and the lateral loads and stuff. I mean, I think it's quite commonly known now that Mercedes invested heavily in the super dyno sort of facilities a few years ago, and that's paid dividends. But clearly there's issues when you put the car on track, and I don't get why they haven't got, Matsushita or Jensen who's around just pounding around Suzuka every week for 2-3 days a week.
In a Super Formula car.
In a Super Formula car, because you could put all the loads through it. You could test a load of things. You could have 2 cars running all the time. If they were genuinely, and I think.
Are you pitching for a job?
I was about to say, if Zach is listening, if you'd like Karun's contact details, do get in touch.
Yeah, but I think that everybody's cut them quite a bit of slack in the last 2 years. 2015 there was a lot of it's their first year back, etc., etc. 2016 there were signs of improvement, so I think everyone sort of thought, okay, they're making progress. I'm not sure this year whether people will be as generous with sort of letting them off the hook.
Now, obviously, this all has a bearing on Alonso. We've got quite a lot of questions about Alonso. There's one here from Adrian King. With the ongoing McLaren problems, is there a strong possibility that Alonso will not see this year out? Anyone?
I think he'll stay in regardless, because you've got a very interesting time in the driver market coming up for next year. A lot of contracts are coming up for renewal. The whole market could be blown apart. I think you'd want to be around for that rather than you're going to be, if your current currency, it's better than if you've been seen to have jacked it in halfway through the season.
So there's a question here from Lucio Chiodi, who is wondering where he's going to go. Really, Red Bull isn't really an option?
Probably not. They've got their own junior program.
And they've got 3 really good guys, and potentially if Kvyat gets set together, a 4th as well.
You would think if they lose one of Ricciardo, Verstappen, it'll be Sainz that gets the nod. So no, I wouldn't have said Red Bull. Ferrari, going back to Ferrari, probably difficult on both sides. I wouldn't say impossible, but probably difficult.
He's back at McLaren now, I suppose. So.
Yeah, exactly. And if the car's a rocket ship, it's amazing how quickly you can forget about all your previous history. So possibly Mercedes. I don't know. I think there's generally a reluctance to put Hamilton and Alonso together from the team management. Although it's what a lot of the fans would love to see. If Lewis decides to stop, who knows? I don't see that he is. I don't see any signs that he's thinking like that. But yeah, I mean, he would, I guess, be the obvious shoe-in for that.
I wonder if he has a shout of going back to Renault, if Renault start to make the Works Renault team start to show signs of progress.
He could go back there anytime he wanted, yeah.
No, that's what I mean. Yeah. I wonder if that's a conversation that happens later this year.
Problem is anywhere he goes, the car will immediately be uncompetitive, won't it? I mean, can you think of another F1 driver from history who's as talented as Alonso, but has had such bad luck / made bad decisions in terms of team movements? Because everywhere he goes, the car doesn't perform.
Yeah, Chris Amon, similar, but a lot of it's, as you suggested, a lot of it was a lot of those problems were he made himself. So he set himself off on a course sort of in 2007, really, and it's still rebounding now. The run on from that is still playing out.
It still seems remarkable that more than 10 years have passed since he won his second world title.
Mm.
Just
Well, it's the
It
10th
was like
anniversary
yesterday.
of Hamilton coming into the sport, and that seems very recent as well.
So my theory, and it is theory, Lewis will go to Ferrari and he'll finish his career at Ferrari as Ayrton wanted to finish his career at Ferrari, and then Fernando will go to Mercedes. Mainly because that'll be a great cover. But actually, wow, you know, and that, let's face it, that's not beyond the realms of possibility, is
But
it?
things like that open
up.
up if the Ferrari is competitive. You know, suddenly it's a fascinating prospect for more reasons than just we're going to see better competition on the track. Suddenly, the whole kaleidoscope of possibilities. You go, oh wow!
And what if Kimi out-qualifies Seb like he did last year? You know, what if Kimi suddenly emerges as the number one in Ferrari? Then what happens?
Well, Seb will go to McLaren.
As a loyal listener of the Motorsport podcasts, you can get 25% off the AMG Basic Training half-day course at Mercedes-Benz World. It's an action-packed, track-based experience with expert tuition, and the offer is valid until May 31st, 2017. Simply call Mercedes-Benz World on 0370 400 4000 and quote offer AMG25. For more information, go to www.mercedes-benzworld.co.uk. Let's have a look at Hamilton and Bottas. Going to a new team, Mercedes Works team, having Hamilton as a teammate, has Bottas made, first of all, has he made the right decision doing this one-year deal? And is he really going to be able to be on a par with Hamilton at points?
Has he made the right decision? It's obviously yes.
Totally.
You're never, ever going to say no to driving for the World Championship favourite, irrespective of who's in the other car. You know, I think we were talking about before whether drivers, and Nick asked the question, do teams show their hand until qualifying? I don't think drivers like Lewis or Kimi, for example, or Seb show their hand fully until Q2, Q3. I think they like, you know, Kimi famously used to do it to Montoya at McLaren. You know, he wouldn't show his hand till they got to qualifying, and then he'd blitz him in 2006. And that complete, you know, all of a sudden all the Latino toys had come out the pram. And I think that's something that we're all thinking it. So I'm sure Valtteri is as well. I'm sure Valtteri is quite aware that this bloke's probably got 3 or 4 tenths in his hand when he needs it. I'll be interested to see how they get on. Honestly, it's impossible to judge from pre-season testing.
That's a curious dynamic there, isn't it? Because what do you do if you're Bottas? Do you play the same tactic, which it's potentially not going to be particularly revealing if you want to know how quick you can go in this car? Or do you just go absolutely flat out in testing?
I think Valtteri's priority of pre-season testing is really to understand the working method of the team. The language they speak when they do a setup change. What does it do to the car? How do they deal with problem solving, a balance issue? How just understanding the systems. You know, we famously when you watch on board with Rosberg, or it's particularly Rosberg, you know, there's a lot of brake balance changes across the qualifying lap, you know, and that wasn't something you saw a lot of the other drivers doing. You know, you see the odd change, but not as much. You know, why was he doing that? Is that something I need to do in qualifying? And, you know, there's all that kind of stuff. And I think it's about doing the long runs and understanding how they communicate strategically, how they make, you know, changes to the strategy, things like that are what his test program isn't about looking for the last couple of tenths. It's about getting comfortable in the environment and trying to get up to speed with the car.
Q3 again, isn't it then, in Australia?
I find it very hard to assess just how good Valtteri Bottas might or might not be. I mean, he was good in GP3, and he's looked decent in his time with Williams, but there were times...
We'll find out in 2 weeks' time.
Well, we will, but it's very hard to know, to be sure, to have a clear picture, because, I mean, there were some times when he was plain blown off by Felipe Massa. Last year, not so much, but Massa was arguably beyond his sell-by date a little bit, maybe. But I just find his true potential very hard to assess. It just, you know, up and down performances. Sometimes excellent, sometimes barely visible.
Yeah, I mean, he'll have nowhere to hide in a Mercedes,
No.
You know, because even on a bad day, he should be qualifying in the top 4, assuming Ferrari are where we think they're potentially going to be. Even on his worst day, he should be 4th. But, you know, he's up against the bloke who is... In every generation, there's been a super talent that's arrived, and Lewis undoubtedly is one of those. So this is where you'll get your answer.
In terms of competitiveness, though, anything less than slotting in where Nico left off, don't mean necessarily winning the championship, just in comparison and pace to Lewis, anything less than that, it's game over, isn't it? Surely.
Yeah, sure. And that's still one of the hottest seats on the grid, you know.
And that means being within a tenth and a half most of the time, sometimes faster.
And you can be sure that people like Sainz and people like Alonso and Van Dorn, I mean, we're all talking about Alonso, but to me, Van Dorn is potentially the most talented rookie to have arrived into F1 since Hamilton. And, you know, what's he going to do? Surely that talent can't be wasted driving a car that, you know, that potentially can't finish the races. So you'd imagine he's on the phone. Toto's a
big fan as well.
Toto's a big fan, and you know, you'd imagine he's going to be on the phone fairly soon if, as Mark says, that scenario plays out where Valtteri isn't able to match what Nico did.
Well, there's going to be a lot of voicemails from Formula One drivers on Toto's phone, isn't there? Let's talk about Williams, where Bottas has come from. There's a question here from Wallace, who wants to know your take on Williams in 2017, especially with the arrival of Paddy Lowe. The Bottas deal, would that have ensured absolute parity on engine spec between the factory team and Williams?
I think they'll have their pace looks respectable, and they're not going to be challenging, you know, the works Mercedes, but they never have done. It looks a good, solid, consistent car from testing. It's probably got arguably the weakest driver lineup on the grid.
There is a question here from Ray asking whether it is the worst driver lineup.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
Felipe's that one.
Felipe, I think, was already past his best last year.
17.8 to Valtteri, 17.3 I think to qualifying.
Yeah,
last year.
Which, you know, was well down on his previous year's performances against Valtteri. So there were already suggestions there that his performance was tailing off last year. He's been pulled out of retirement to help a team out. So you got to question what his level of commitment would be. I'm sure he's loving being back, because why wouldn't you? But I'd still say there's question marks about. You know, how far on the edge do you put it? How, you know, just the little questions in the back of your mind. And Stroll, very, very inexperienced. He's had a few shunts in testing. I wouldn't necessarily say it's going to be a disaster for Stroll. He could get there in the end, but at the moment he's not at the level to come straight in the manner of, you know, some of the starring rookies of the we've seen of recent years. So we'll see, but they will get points. They'll look respectable at times, struggle at other times. I think it's a holding season for Williams, and planning for the future with Paddy joining.
Maybe Alonso will go there.
Well, yeah, maybe. And maybe, you know, with the Stroll investing, allowing more of the programs to be switched on to properly take advantage of the team's facilities, because it's sort of in that awkward no man's land. It's not a big team. It's not a little compact Force India team either. But to properly access the potential of that probably needs a bit more investment, and that's, I guess, where Stroll comes in. And if that's being directed by Paddy long term, you'd say that's probably a very good plan.
What do you think they would have got for the Bottas deal? Because I'm sure they would have. They bargained quite heavily. Would they have got a lump sum, or would they have got more parity on the engine?
A lump sum, I understand. Quite a substantial one.
All right, well, that answers
it's
that
a
one.
Public company. You'll find out fairly soon when you see the accounts.
Yeah. A team we haven't really talked about, Red Bull. Arguably one of the strongest driver lineups on the grid. Are Verstappen and Ricciardo going to be friends at the end of the season?
I think if they're not fighting for the World Championship, I think the pressure of fighting for the World Championship certainly will change that dynamic. But at the moment, they're fighting a common goal, which is trying to get the reliability up and therefore unlock the speed. Because unquestionably, as we've seen time and time and again in the last few years, the chassis is good. They haven't been able to unleash all of the power in the high power modes because they're struggling with reliability. Couple of things though, when you look at the Red Bull, and I had quite a good look at it in the pit lane, they didn't seem to be massively keen to pull these screens all around the car as they had done in the past, and they sort of parked at the end of the pit lane quite happily.
Wonder if we see quite a different Red Bull in Melbourne.
Yeah, it doesn't look as complex as I would have expected. It doesn't look as complex as a
the
Ferrari.
bargeboard areas, it's all very plain, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think they've arrived at pre-season testing with a relatively low aimed at lower drag than they would have liked, to see where they are on the lay of the land in terms of performance. And then I can see quite a big update package for Melbourne. And if not, certainly when we come back to Europe for Barcelona, I can see that's the team out of the top three I can see having a very different car in 3 or 4 races time.
That's super exciting, isn't it? The fact that come Australia, or maybe hopefully it's Australia, maybe it's Europe, but Red Bull will turn up and they'll be right there, and that's 6 cars. That's 6 cars all fighting over
It would be
the
good
last
to
10.
have.
Yeah, that's
exactly
what we want. Yeah.
Mark, can you explain to me what the difference is between a Renault engine and a Tag Heuer engine?
It's just the name.
It's just the name. And
Yeah.
so Red Bull, have they been doing any development on their own with that? Or
No,
is
no.
it literally just the name?
No,
So they are
just
still
the name.
using the engine power unit, which is putting aside Honda, that is the weakest out there, would you say?
Well, last year it was probably third, but not that far off. They made big strides last year. It's probably a couple of tenths off last year.
Okay, so it's not too bad.
It wasn't a disaster last year, but it's a moving target. So Ferrari have clearly made gains. Merc have probably made gains. We'll see what the Renault has. It's got new cylinder heads designed by Mario Alien.
He's now left.
He's
though,
left
hasn't he?
now because he's
Right.
completed the task.
Right.
So
They seem to be having ERS issues more than
Yes.
the actual
Yeah, yeah.
ICE engine, didn't they?
Yeah.
There's MGUK sort of issues
Yeah.
and
A lot of
at the-
letters.
with all three.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, the joys of modern Formula One.
Oh, I know.
What about the Renault Works team, Karun? They had a difficult season last year, but
Yep.
it's a case of rebuilding, isn't it? But
Yeah.
they've done a little bit, but how hard is it as Renault to entice the big names and build up the team again?
Honestly, when you watch trackside, I was actually pleasantly surprised. I think actually the car looked a lot better than I expected it to. They're in the there's still a lot of stuff going on that needs to be shaken out. Obviously, they've lost Frederic Vasseur, who I quite like. I think he's actually a really good guy and a true racer. And he's gone now as a team principal. Cyril seems to have sort of taken over that. Whether they'll replace Fred, we'll wait and see. I think Hulkenberg is a good addition. I think he's got a lot of experience now, and he'd be a good number one, good solid number one. The car, looks like last year there were occasions like Azerbaijan, they were on the back row of the grid, and I'm sure it doesn't matter. You can come up with all the rebuilding stories in the world, but when the bosses show up from the Renault boardroom, they would not have been impressed seeing that. This year, they look like they moved themselves out of that pack and into that midfield, Force India, Williams, Haas, potentially, Toro Rosso fight. So I think there's actually 5 teams in that bunch. Williams may be at the head of the bunch, but certainly there's 4 just behind them. So I think it's good progress. But they, at their lowest point when they took over the team, they were down to 435 people, I believe. And at its peak, Enstone was sort of 650. I believe that now in March they'll be back up to sort of 560 or so. So that's quite a big step forward from where they were, this time last year in terms of just number of people working on the chassis side.
What of Force India, Mark? Putting aside the colour, they are sort of known as the team with the biggest bang for its buck in terms of what they spend
I was
and
very
success.
impressed at the launch when Vijay Mallya is batting away Renault's claims that the works teams will just disappear from the independents in this formula because they've got so much more facilities and the integration of the power unit and the chassis would be. He batted that away and said, "I see no reason why we can't go one better and be third this year." I think that's painting it pink. But you know, don't count them out. They for the size of team, they do a remarkable job, and it's just very, very well managed, well tailored team. The hard points are that, right? Okay, we're not doing it our own wind tunnel. We're going to use a Toyota wind tunnel, which has had, you know, one of the millions and millions spent on it. It's a fantastic tunnel. Everybody uses it pretty much. Okay, we're not even going to do our own gearboxes. We'll just take the Merc one. The Merc one works. We know that works. We put that in with the Merc engine. So all those things they don't have you know, ambitions above the station. They just say, right, these are the hard points. This is how much money we have. This is how we're going to do it, and they just manage it very, very well. And they've got a great technical, you know, leader in Andy Green, and they've just got that down pat, how to utilize what they've got very, very, very well. But that's never going to be, you know, unless you have a radical change of regulations. That's never going to be a team that is going to be able to take on the works teams. But it's you know, it's done what it's done. It's fourth last year. It's been fifth. That's just what it does. It's very good.
But importantly, I think they're actually a good case study from a financial standpoint. They're a self-sufficient team now.
Yeah.
You know, they finish fourth. They get X amount of money from FOM. They get X amount of money from driver sponsorship through Perez and now a bit of other sponsorship through. And it's a self-funded team.
So all everybody has to do is finish fourth, and then everybody's fine.
Yes, basically. But also, you know, it sounds easy to say, but actually to use that amount of money they've got, and I think Mark raised a really good point, which is I think Andy Green is actually quite underrated. I'm surprised, for example, that people like Ferrari haven't tried to hit on him. Maybe they have, but I'm surprised people like Ferrari haven't tried to chase him down when they lost James Allison or even McLaren and people like that, because I think he's really, really good at delivering.
He was briefly at Red Bull, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
But it's quite nice because I mean Andy Green goes back to the days when Force India was the Jordan F3000 team, so he was a race engineer there. So it's,
Karun, what about Sauber? Is there light at the end of the tunnel for them? Because they've had a very tough time over the last few years. I guess budgets and money is always the bottom line. But this is going to sound ruder than it's meant to. But what's the point for Sauber? You've got to ask
say what you mean.
I mean, but you've got to ask, haven't you? Because it's because I'm sure they can't be making the finances work.
Well, they've obviously got that investment come through from last I think it was early last year, wasn't it? The Longbow investment came through.
Middle of the season, yeah.
Middle of the season, and that sort of safeguarded their immediate future. You know, getting ahead of Manor last year helped for another chunk of money. But you're right. You know, you look at the car, and actually aesthetically, I quite like the car. I think it actually looks like quite a nice car, and there's quite good detail work on it. You know, they've obviously put a lot of effort into it. But then when you look at the actual livery, there's not many sponsors on it, so that's quite hard. I'm sure there's a bit of money from Mercedes for Verline, and obviously we know about Ericsson, but it's tough for them from a financial standpoint, and also now, I suppose with Renault having moved forward, who are they competing against? I guess McLaren is
well, all they need to do is do more than 11 laps, and they've got them beat. So,
and I think that's a slightly tricky thing, is unless they find the next greatest, and don't forget they were the year-old engine, so start of the season they'll be fine. As the season goes on, that will suffer as the engine development moves on. They will perhaps, I suspect, aim for their traditional path of let's go for mega reliability at the start, try and pick up the odd points, which could happen. They were actually really reliable in pre-season testing, so they'll sort of go for that case model, I'd imagine.
Right, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to take as many readers' questions as possible, and also try and get everyone's thoughts on who they think is going to win this year's championship. There's a question here from Kevin, who is based in Indonesia. Worldwide podcast, this. Mark, there's several drivers who claim this year's car will serve their style better. I'm wondering, seen from trackside, is the difference between styles very apparent? Or are there any drivers who are going to have to change their style?
You can see the drivers carrying more speed in and being more aggressive in combined braking and lateral. So for somebody like Fernando, that will be very good. Yes, you can see it more. Whereas before everybody was sort of held back to the same false ceiling. Certainly in the race, there were. Yeah, I think I think everybody's good enough on there to be able to assess what the tyre needs and adapt the driving style. I don't think it's that it's going to penalise or reward one more than the other. But you will see differences in style more easily on these tyres than on what we had before. Yeah.
Karun, one here from Sam Smith. What do you think of the proposed wet starts? First of all, what are they, and what are the proposed starts, and what do you think?
Well, I think it's just not just for wet starts, but I think anytime we see a safety car, I believe they'd come back to the grid lineup and they'll see another start, which would be entertaining for the fans. I think there's still a few question marks over how exactly it's going to pan out in terms of actual procedure and how practically it's going to work. But there are some changes. For example, the car who starts in the pit lane, for example, the safety car laps actually at the start of the race no longer count, from what I understand. So they'll do the laps on the safety car. It doesn't actually count towards the Grand Prix. They come back onto the grid to do the standing start. At that point, the guy comes to the pit lane. So we'll see some changes. It could mean potentially more incidents. It could mean opportunities to jumble up the order. I mean, races like Melbourne pretty much guaranteed a safety car, aren't we, every year? Yeah. So I think we should get a fairly quick look at how it works quite soon into the season.
So, Karun, I know you've got strong thoughts on sort of huge runoff and huge tarmac runoff. Yeah, exactly. So that's why I'm going to come to you for this question. This is actually one from Nauman, who we took a question from earlier. He's basically, this is sort of quite a long question, but he's just asking, is there no one else apart from Herman Tilke in terms of designing tracks? Because he says that a lot of the tracks he's designed aren't producing exciting racing. So there's that question. And the second part is from Ray, and he's asking about the endless runoffs and is this ever going to change? It seems like a driver can go off the circuit, rejoin, lose no time, and then finish a Grand Prix and be told that he had a wonderful drive.
Yeah, I mean, the first question, there are other people who design circuits. I mean, Alex Wirtz runs a company that does it. There's a guy called Clive Bowen who runs a company called Apex. They did Dubai and China, a couple others. So there are other people out there. Tilke has obviously monopolized in many ways the F1 market, I think, for recent circuits. But it's a very simplistic thing to do, to blame Tilke and his people for what's going on. Circuits are designed in conjunction with the FIA and the FIA safety department and the Circuits Commission. So there's a lot of committees and commissions involved with these decision-making processes. For example, a circuit like Le Mans, every year we go back to Le Mans, we see more and more tarmac runoffs and more tarmac put down, and that's got nothing to do with Tilke.
Circuit of America is Tilke, isn't it?
Sorry?
Circuit of Americas, that's Tilke, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
That's a great circuit.
It's a great circuit, yeah. But I mean, it's got lots of tarmac runoffs, but it's a great circuit. And Sepang, I think Sepang's actually a great circuit to drive on. You get great racing and there's something for the drivers. So it's easy to knock him. But I don't know what the answer is, to be honest, and why we seem to be going a long way down this path of tarmac runoffs. And then it just adds complication. We try and find a high curb, or we try and find AstroTurf. I don't know how many more times I got to say I don't see what's wrong with real grass and real gravel. There's a lot of complications with the bikes as well, because the FIM have their own safety norms for the same circuits. But surely you can put 6 meters of grass and gravel and then have 10 kilometers of tarmac, and it'll stop a lot of what we're seeing of people corner cutting and putting wheels off track.
The basic ones in terms of bikes versus cars is the bikes want the kitty litter, and then the cars want tarmac. Yeah. So it's a sort of constant battle. But Silverstone manages just about. Yeah,
but you still have the Exeter Club, Exeter Cops. The constant arguments about do we have 6 inches of the wheel over the white line, I hate having those arguments. It's like we should be when qualifying's over, we should be looking at the sector times and the lap time. We shouldn't immediately be wondering, are they going to show us a replay of a guy with half a wheel over the white line of cops? The result should be the result.
The key there is not to have Vettel behind you, who is then constantly radioing in saying that Fernando's gone over the white line again.
Yeah.
Right. I fear for a kind of a rule or something being dreamt up where a time penalty is imposed on the car during its next lap. So, it's only allowed to use 3/4 of its performance or something like that. It's where maybe the new era of the sport that we've been discussing, the Liberty era, we have to kind of monitor that closely, because I can imagine it'd be relatively straightforward to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that'll be slightly outside their scope. I mean, these track limits things deserve its own podcast, I think, but
yes.
We could go on for ages. But fundamentally, the other issue is the inconsistency. How do we choose some corners we just turn a blind eye, and other corners we police, and all of this stuff. Let's just figure out a way to get real grass and real gravel and real deterrence. Actually, Paul Ricard's a good example, because that's tarmac runoffs everywhere. But the way they've done the negative curbs and the step on the curb means that in a lot of places, by actually going beyond the curb, beyond the white line, you lose performance because the plank of the car hits the floor and you scrub speed. So, there are solutions around the world. We just need to find them and then make it consistently implemented.
I just think we have to have Suzuka in every country, surely.
But even that's
Simon's
got
always
more
got a
tarmac.
sensible suggestion.
Look at turn one, look at Degner, they're putting more tarmac there as well.
But I remember in 2009, when we went back to Suzuka after a couple of years at Fuji, all the 11-year-old Toro Rosso drivers were crashing during qualifying, and everyone was all indignant. Oh, someone said to Kimi, do you think it's ridiculous that we race at a circuit like this? And Kimi said, no, absolutely not. You should be punished for making a mistake. It's the most animated I've ever seen him, actually. Yeah. And it was good to hear.
Well, to me, Spa's ruined. With all the tarmac we have around Spa, it has actually been ruined. It's no longer the challenge that it should be and it used to be.
I feel as I've opened a can of worms here. Never thought about doing the TT, the Isle of Man TT. There's no runoff there. I think you'd probably quite enjoy that.
Well, all Goodwood. I love going to Goodwood every year. Yeah. I mean, I said to Williams, we ought to, with the heritage stuff, we ought to try and see if we could run a car on there. But I think Johnny Williams got a little bit twitchy at that point. At the prospect of a 14B thrashed around
Goodwood. Blimey. I'd pay to see that. Right. Looking for one name. Who would you put money behind this season?
I'll take money out of it, because the answer I would say is Hamilton, but that'll be a rubbish bet, because he's obviously going to be the favourite. My hope is that it's going to be much closer, and it could be Vettel or Kimi or whatever. But if I had to put my life on it, I'd say Hamilton.
Okay, so three names. It didn't give Toivonen though, so improvement.
Yeah, well, you didn't mention Tot. So,
Simon.
Well, he's just nicked my answer, because logic suggests Lewis Hamilton. If I was actually putting money on it, I'd probably put a each-way flutter on the two Ferrari drivers.
Right. Nick?
I guess I'm always looking for a story. Who do I think is going to win? Lewis. I think he'll win. I would like to see Kimi or Verstappen win for the story.
I concur. I mean, I think Lewis is the obvious one, but I've actually bet. I got 6-1 on Vettel for the championship, and I got 12-1 on Kimi for Melbourne. So I think that's quite a good bet.
That's very good. He's down 8-1 today.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see.
Ed, come on, and yourself.
I would like to see Ricciardo fighting properly for a world championship, because I think he's not necessarily an underrated driver, because I think people do rate him, but I'd like to see him get more success. He's a kind of guy that is good for Formula One. He's different from a lot of Formula One drivers. Who's engages with people, I think, on a better level. So there we go.
Okay, one crazy bet then. I've got a bet that Force India will win a race this year.
I'll take that.
Yeah, so I need another crazy bet from
McLaren
you guys.
to finish on the podium. This is never going to happen, is it? You get
Force India to win a race. Yeah. McLaren on the podium.
If it's a simple fix, as Mark suggests, there's a small percentage. It could be small percentage chance. If I lose the money, Mark, I'll come and find you.
Van Dorn, I'd qualify Alonso over the season.
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Karun.
Karun to replace
Actually, no,
Massa.
Actually, no. I think mine will be Karun to spend most of the year at Suzuka driving around in a super Formula car with a Honda hybrid engine.
Or a TT.
I really hope that bet comes through. Well, go on. You haven't. Is that actually going to be your bet?
Yeah, that's my bet.
Wow,
yeah.
okay, good for you.
No.
I'm going to.
I'm still thinking.
I'm going to say Verstappen to beat Ricciardo across the season. I don't know how crazy that is. Does that count as crazy?
No, that's not crazy.
That's not crazy enough.
That's not
Okay.
crazy enough.
I'm going to say Kimi to beat Seb across the season.
Still not
Crazy,
crazy enough.
Really?
but it's still not enough.
Yeah.
We want more
Well,
than
where's
that.
that, where's that
Go long.
crazy threshold here?
Well, I think maybe it's
Just look to your left.
All right.
something about Seb.
Works Renault to get a podium. How about that?
yeah.
Does that count?
Okay.
That's
And
absolutely.
it's probably not that crazy. Sauber to beat McLaren in the Championship for Constructors.
Wow.
Good lord.
Right. Well, there we go. We're going to be back at the end of the season. We're going to obviously review the whole season, but we've got loads of podcasts in between now and then. So thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Karun, so much for coming in. Thank you, Alan, as always, for recording
You're
all
going to
this.
have biscuits next time. I keep getting promised these biscuits every time I come to a podcast. You get
Did
coffee,
I
no
promise them
biscuits.
again and I didn't
Yeah,
deliver?
again.
Okay, I'll tell you what, when McLaren finishes on the podium, I'll send loads of biscuits over. Thank you so much for watching and thank you so much for listening. We'll see you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
For rain. For snow. For performance. Formatic. Formatic all-wheel drive. Now available for C-Class.